Hello, this is James from Canonical. Today we are talking about the Garlic Ballads by Mo Yan.
In some previous episodes, like our Chinese science fiction series, we, or at least I, may have taken some authors like Liu Cixin to task for their political stances. But I want to discuss whether that's fair. When Mo Yan won the Nobel in 2012, there was a big debate over whether he deserved the prize. Some critics cited his leadership role in the government run Chinese Writers Association, while others pointed to his participation in the creation of a handwritten anniversary edition of Mao's 1942 talks at the Yan'an Forum on Literature and Art, which are largely blamed for the culture of repression in Chinese literature and art. I think these things are worth scrutiny, but do you think that's the whole story? Can we condemn him the same way, for example, that our previous writer, Herta Mueller, did when she cited the horrors of living under a repressive socialist regime and suggesting that Mo Yan's complicit in Chinese political repression?
I mean, if he were a typical writer doing typical things, I would say that we are too critical of his win, Nobel Prize win. But the things that he does, because we don't know all of what he's up to, we don't know his entire life, but some of the things that he does are so symbolically resonant that they cast a shadow over his whole career. So to me, I think it's still fair to criticize him for what he's done, specifically hand copying the talks at Yan'an. I think that that is a very symbolically loaded thing to do, and I don't think that that's something that we should let him have a pass on.
My question is that something he could have begged out of? Because he does hold, like a leadership position. Could he refuse to do it? Um, I would say probably yes. I think if he didn't want to do it, he probably could have just said, I don't want to do this or found someone else to do it, which in my mind makes it worse. But if he was compelled to do it, if, there's this threat to maybe not on his life because other people have done way worse in China and have lived, but some kind of threat to his well-being.
Well, like, could they have quashed his career as a
Yeah.
writer?
Yeah. So that's my question is, I mean, there are plenty of dissident writers who have made their stand and as a result are banned from entering the country. And so I feel like that is something that we have to keep in mind because if he was compelled to do it, and once again, we don't know, that's part of the problem is we don't know if he was compelled or if he is a full-throated believer in, celebrating Mao and the talks at Yan'an. So I think that does color how we might understand his actions.
Here, I think there's something that's worth sharing because actually, your position, James, is similar to a professor of Chinese at the University of Virginia, I believe. His name is Charles Laughlin. And in an article, an unpublished article, he says basically this: criticizing Mo Yan's participation in the handwritten talks implies that Mo Yan was supposed to conspicuously refuse to participate in this unremarkable act of political ritual. He goes on to say that this is the same sort of thing that a lot of people do in China, and it doesn't mean anything. He says this is a mild gesture of patriotism, even less surprising when performed by a leader of the government's Writers Association. Does such an act really imply an affirmation of Mao's worst atrocities? And then the final passage I think is also really important. Laughlin says, Mo Yan is a literary man, but he is also a government official. And in this latter capacity, one would expect him to perform any number of inane, meaningless, and harmless ritual activities and observances. So, to this type of response, I would say possibly yes. By being a government official, you may have certain expectations that you have to meet, but is that something that we can square with being a writer of serious fiction?
The problem I have with that response, even though I do kind of agree with it to a degree, the problem I have with it is it's presenting it as if he had no thought to what this meant and he didn't really think too deeply of it. It's kind of like, here's something I have to do as part of my job. Here I go scribbling away, right? Um, I find it hard to believe that a person doing this will not put some thought into what it means to do it, no matter how serious of a writer you are. I mean, if you're just the regular bureaucrat, then sure, yeah, you do all that kind of crap all the time in China. But as someone who's a writing, thinking person, I think he must have thought about what this meant. So that's why, for me, it's less of this kind of thoughtless task. It's more of a question of how much he is compelled to do so.
I guess what Laughlin is saying is that because it happens so frequently, it doesn't really mean much. And if he chose not to do it, that would be more conspicuous. But I don't think that it is meaningless. But even if it were meaningless, if people are not able to choose which activities they participate in, how can they have intellectual or moral authority? And if being a government official means that Moyan must do what people expect of him, does that mean that being a literary man is incompatible with being a government official?
I'm going to sidestep that question for a minute by also pointing out that in that same article, Laughlin talks about how maybe too much symbolism is put on top of those talks, that those talks maybe should not be looked at as among the worst of Mao's, policies, and that the subject matter that it calls for writers to embrace the ruralness of China, that actually goes in line also with Mo Yan's style of writing.
They say that, but they say a whole lot more than that. And I think that it's fair to say that these are things that we should study and we should remember and we should learn from. But copying them by hand is quite different from studying them as a text with historical significance. It's more of a celebration or a veneration. And the comparison that I think is worth making, especially in light of China's reforms, it's like making a new statue of Robert E. Lee to replace the one that was torn down in Richmond. Like, why would you do that? What does it mean to do that?
I think it is like that of a sort, in that Robert E. Lee is reviled by certain people in the world. But I think the problem here is the person, Mao, is really complicated as a political figure. Like in China, you would probably say he's more like Thomas Jefferson than Robert E. Lee. So Thomas Jefferson had a lot of problems too. Obviously, he did not commit as many atrocities as Mao Zedong. But at the same time, if you talk to people in China, they don't think that Mao committed as many atrocities as he is portrayed in Western history. So, how can you square that? Because if he is someone who grew up in China and has a different understanding of who this political figure is than ours, how much fault do you ascribe to this action? And how much harm does this action do? Is a question that's worth considering, because I don't think that we can, all three of us were raised and grew up in the US, and we have our Western perspective of Mao, which is more or less historically accurate, but it lacks a lot of context that people in China lived through. So I think it is difficult for those of us who don't grow up in China to have that kind of context and understand what he means. At the same time, the people in China who have had history censored, they don't know the full historical picture of what he did. So it's kind of like this situation where neither has a perspective that's as whole as it can be. That's what makes it complicated when you start saying, well, he copied something that a genocidal maniac, for example, like people have talked about Mao in that way. He copied a text that's written by a genocidal maniac. I mean, people in China don't view him that way. They view him like a Jefferson or a Washington. So it gets really, really complicated when you start venturing into what this text means and what Mao means, and where and when you factor in the fact that he grew up in the countryside as a peasant, that adds an extra layer. So in the end, I'd say, like, with this, I don't know, because I lack that perspective. So I feel in a way some kind of sympathy for this kind of for I feel a little bit bad for his position, because I think you can't escape your upbringing. And he grew up during the Cultural Revolution. He's a little bit younger than my parents, and my parents' generation grew up during the Cultural Revolution like he did. And they argue amongst each other about what Mao did and whether what he did was right or wrong. Like, there are family squabbles between my uncles who won't talk to each other because they disagree about the merits and demerits of what Mao did. So I think the problem is, one of the underlying assumptions we have from a Western perspective is we just think Mao is bad and he's done something bad. And that is also an unthinking perspective, because I think we are not challenging the complexities of that situation when we consider it and just say it's bad.